Hey guys, welcome back to another episode of the Abundance Matrix Underground podcast. In today's episode, we are diving into the concept of controlled opposition. Now, this episode is for people who have woken up and maybe keep getting pulled in a little bit to the psychic warfare game of the lack matrix. This is most prevalent right now on the planet through politics. So it's for people who see the corruption, have seen through it, have been disillusioned, but haven't quite found the exit door. It's for people who have felt the awakening, but maybe have felt a lot of fear or waves of fear come in, because when you really start to see how corrupt the entire thing is, and that it's not about sides, it's not about choosing the right side or being on the right side of history or being on the right team. It can feel destabilizing because it's a completely different way of operating. So we're not falling back asleep, we're stepping beyond polarity, and that's why this message is timely. So controlled opposition, as I'm going to be talking about it in this episode, is the illusion of choice in the lack matrix. It's the system giving you the idea of sides so that you never leave the battlefield. It keeps you believing that you're rebelling while you're still feeding the grid of lack with all of that rebellious energy. And remember, powerful emotion is the greatest feeder of lack, and specifically lower vibrational frequencies love and feed the most off of fear, guilt, shame, war, and sacrifice. So we are not opposing power. That's not what we're actually doing. And this is where we can get stuck in the lack matrix. We're not against power. We're not opposing power. We're not at war with power. And we are no longer worshiping an external power. We are tuning into the power within. We are being fed from within. We are directly getting our needs met through God. We are having a direct relationship with Source itself. So what we're going to dive into in this episode is the political meaning of controlled opposition and how awakening can become an area where we get paranoid. Some people even go into psychosis. I've seen even very gifted spiritual people go into psychosis if they tap too deeply into the psychic game of the grid, because everybody's psychic. The whole system is psychic. The lack matrix works psychically. It psychically influences us. So if we open our psychic abilities and stay in duality, the lack matrix can really fuck with us. This is where mass formation psychosis happens, individual psychosis, spiritual psychosis, deep fear, paranoia, cults, all of it lives here. So turning your psychic abilities on is not a guarantee of being safe at all. In fact, it can make you very unsafe if you don't understand how the game works. So we're going to tap on that a little bit. Why outrage and over-vigilance or hyper-vigilance is really a midpoint in our consciousness, and it's not the full overcoming. So it's an important place to be, but there's more after it. Also, we're going to talk about how polarity consciousness starves our creative power. When we stay in the lack matrix, it starves us out. It starves out our ability to create solutions, which is what we naturally do. Also, we're going to talk about how the nervous system gets addicted to righteousness and this whole being good and right. I talked about this a lot. This is how a lot of empaths get looped in psychically to the lack matrix. And also how our true sovereignty, when we're in our true sovereignty, we do not choose sides. It's not about sides. We create. So I want you to know you don't have to pick a side to exit the lack matrix. That's not what it's about at all. You don't win by fighting. We transcend by creating. We don't need to protect ourselves or others by policing the truth and what the truth is. We protect ourselves by embodying the truth. We don't need to prove anything. Remember, we're not here to convince people of anything through a means of words or outrage. We need to embody what we believe, and that's a greater influence. So this conversation is really meant to help free your psychic energy from the binary of the lack matrix, from that captivity, the psychic captivity of the lack matrix, which is what I talked about a couple weeks ago, or in the last one of the episodes. It literally is called that, I think, the psychic captivity of empath or something like that, but definitely listen to it if you haven't. And then if you're in the YouTube membership, you guys will be hearing this first, of course, but I'll be doing a separate recording that will anchor us into this somatic practice for this energy of controlled opposition, where that controlled opposition is happening in our physical vessels and how we can release it. Some rituals to help regulate the nervous system out of this threat identification, and practices to move from this polarity consciousness to more presence and awareness with the now and the source within us. So let's just dive right in. I'm going to pull up my notes because I do have a lot that I'm going to tap into today, but I'm going to try to make this short or shorter. So, also just to frame all of this, you guys in the membership know this, but we're working with the Queen of Pentacles this season, and she's really the archetype that is bringing through this for me. Me working with her archetype has brought through all of this. So the Queen of Pentacles specifically helps us embody more of a neutral power in our physical vessels, because she's the embodied reality of creation itself. So she does not debate truths. She births worlds. She's rooted into the body. She's rooted into earth, and she's rooted into creation. This is where we're going to be coming from, even though we're going to be talking about very 3D things. And this season in the membership, we are ritualizing this archetype within us by becoming ungovernable by fear. We're no longer being governed by fear. So I'm just going to talk about, it's 11:11 right now, right as we get started. I want to talk about what controlled opposition means in the lack matrix, how people use it when they're talking in politics. And I'll also dive into what it means spiritually. But in the mainstream lack matrix, specifically in politics, controlled opposition is usually pointing to a person or a movement that appears to oppose the system or oppose the corruption, but is secretly working for it. It's the belief that rebels are planted by the system itself, and that dissenting leaders are actually puppets, that revolutionaries are infiltrators, and that every movement has a secret master or puppeteer behind it, that there's no real resistance. The whole thing is staged. So you'll hear people say, oh, he's controlled opposition. She's a plant. They pretend to resist, but really they serve an agenda. And it's a fear-coded cynicism. It's important to understand this. It also is true. That does happen. Remember, the lack matrix is incredibly sophisticated, but it also uses those very mechanisms to psychically bond us to it. So we don't even know who we are outside of those mechanisms. So that's why we always fear the other, and we're ultimately at fear with our creative power. So there's no real awakening in this ideology. Every leader is a trick. Everything is a trick. Everything that's hopeful is a trick. And we start, through the lens of this, we start to see everybody as not real individual humans, all being influenced by this whole system, which goes way beyond politics. We begin to see it all as a show. And it actually desensitizes us to the trauma of the game itself. So it feels like we're fighting shadows instead of building our futures, because we become this can lead us down a path of being so cynical of everything that we don't choose anything. We don't do anything. So this idea of controlled opposition arises when someone realizes that corruption exists, but hasn't yet fully realized that sovereignty exists, sovereignty outside of the system altogether. So they still believe they have to have the system, and this is the trauma bond to the system. So it's people who awaken to the deception, but they haven't yet awoken to creation itself. It's like mid-awakening consciousness. And there are people that are here are aware enough to distrust power, which is an important part of the full awakening, but they're not yet sovereign enough to embody power. So they can often get stuck, and people on social media do this. People who call out, the shadow government or whatever can get stuck here, just completely stuck in this idea of the shadow government, and everything is a show and a game. Everything's controlled opposition. And they become so obsessed with fighting this invisible power or this whatever complete illusion, but they don't embody power. And so they actually just feed it. They can see the puppet show, but they don't exit out. They don't go out of the matrix. So how this translates spiritually, or in spiritual terms, controlled opposition basically is when the ego believes that awakening fully is dangerous, or that awakening is just about seeing how corrupt everything is. But there's nothing and often their whole calling becomes about calling out the corruption. Now, I want to be clear, the corruption needs to be called out. And everything has a place. We're not talking about what's right and what's wrong. We're talking about a journey of awakening, and this is part of the journey. So I'm not making it wrong, but I just want you to see that there's something outside of this, sovereignty even from this. So the ego believes that everything's dangerous. It keeps us in duality by making us suspect every voice, every ally, and eventually yourself. It's the voice of suspicion that talks about all leaders are false. No one can be trusted. Every movement is infiltrated. Anyone who rises must be corrupt. Anyone who has power must be corrupt. If you succeed, you'll be co-opted. Yes, all of this has and does happen, but it doesn't mean it always will, and that's all that exists. And if we can't embody what's outside of this, all we do is fuel this. And we bring more, by our attention to it actually makes it bigger and can cause a paranoia and fear. And again, this is where a lot of people go into spiritual psychosis. They don't get out of the paranoia place. So it basically weaponizes awakening against itself. This is basically part of how handlers, part of how demons, part of how the trauma that was formed in lack, the trauma bonds of lack, just reinforces itself. Like it holds us back through our awakening, or tries to keep us from being fully liberated from the game. So the psyche, or our creative energy, essentially stays in captivity even when the cage door is open. So we see it's open for us, but we get too locked into the power of the matrix itself because it's incredibly powerful. And remember, I talked about psychic energy being opened. A lot of times people will turn on their psychic abilities. They'll turn on their creative power, but they don't see outside of the matrix. They don't see the exit door. So their mind can collapse in on itself because the black matrix is so sophisticated and will reinforce and reinforce and reinforce. It can make you feel absolutely insane. So this is how the psyche stays in captivity. And controlled opposition is the psychic reflex that says, don't rise. Rising is how they get you. So it's like they stay as these undercover police officers to police the lack matrix, but they don't actually rise out of it. So it keeps you in the hallway between awakening and sovereignty. You don't get out. You see the corruption, but you don't yet see your creative authority and take up that creative authority. And you can't, it's like the trauma bond to the lack matrix. You stay frozen in vigilance, scanning for deception, and you remain reactive instead of generative. It's a trap. And it's one that needs to be called out because I'm seeing it so much. I've seen it for a while. It's always been there. I've been in it. I've been through doors of it. And I think because I've seen people in my own life go through it and go the paranoid route, go the extreme route, to the point where you just can't even relate to them anymore, and they can't relate to the world. And you see how that doesn't, there's got to be something beyond that. So I've skirted around this, and I've definitely touched it and been in it, but I've also always sort of seen that it's a trap. And I've been feeling urged more and more to speak about this, yet not knowing exactly how specifically. But right now, I've never seen anything like what's going on right now on social media in terms of politically both sides of the spectrum, extremism coming out, like extremism in this sense. So you have people waking up on both quote unquote sides, people who've identified with this political side or that political side, waking up to how corrupt one side is or the other, but still thinking that it's just that side and not understanding that it's the entire mechanism itself. So we stay trapped there. And we remain reactive instead of generative, which is important to understand, because when creative energy flows abundantly, we create new worlds, and it's created through our desires, through our urge. So the spiritual truth behind this is that in the lack matrix, there are no real sides. There is no true enemy. There is only one frequency system competing with itself to stay alive. That's it. Controlled opposition isn't a person. It's the illusion that polarity is real. It's the ego architecture of lack saying there must always be a good side and a bad side. Even the rebels are worshiping power outside of themselves. They believe that corruption is ultimate authority, so they fight corruption instead of transcending it. Controlled opposition spiritually means everyone's still playing the same game. Who has the power? That's it. Awakened sovereigns don't play the game. We generate power from within. We don't fight for the system. We don't fight the system outside of us. So it's important to understand that, or it's important to understand why the controlled opposition narrative even exists in the first place. So it exists because the system needs an enemy. It needs an enemy to survive. It doesn't care who the enemy is or what the enemy is. It just can't be. It can't see itself. The enemy's out there. It's somewhere out there always. That's how it justifies sacrifice. So the ego needs a villain to feel righteous. The psyche and our psychic fears, hold on, how do I want to say this? Our psychic energy often fears sovereignty more than corruption because we are trauma bonded to that system. So even though we see that it's bad and good, it's also met certain needs for us. It's the only thing we know. It's how the world has functioned for so long. We don't know anything outside of it. We don't know who we are outside of it. We've been deeply programmed to mistrust our creative energy and mistrust each other. People aren't safe. We're not safe. So what do you do when you know the system is corrupt, but there's nothing else? So the psyche fears sovereignty more than corruption, and lack can only survive through this division and suspicion of what we are. So the nervous system thinks vigilance, hypervigilance equals safety. So controlled opposition keeps you believing truth must be protected, awakening must be defended, we must stay alert to the infiltrators in the movement. As long as we are still talking about the movement or believing that we're part of some rebel like army, we're in the game, we're in the illusion. And it's attractive to us because it's fed the nervous system for so long, and it gives us the illusion of power, that we're doing something, we're taking power back. But we're actually terrified of power, and we don't want it. Not when we're truly rooted in lack. So it keeps awakening in a paranoia state instead of a powerful state. We embody the lack matrix. We embody the war instead of embodying heaven on earth, embodying enough, embodying abundance, embodying solutions, creative solutions. So in the literal 3D meaning of the world, controlled opposition in the lack matrix, in politics and in conspiracy spaces, it's basically a supposed awakened or rebellious leader who's secretly serving the system's agenda, and they know it. Like, they know their plan. The problem with this, I do believe this happens, but what I'm seeing happening online with everything is everybody, specifically in comment sections, and how much of this is real, we don't even know, because we know there's actual farm bots that just perpetuate the war and make us, like, it creates an illusion of what people are actually thinking and feeling, and it influences people to think and feel that way. So keep that in mind. But what I'm seeing is it's just nonstop all over. Nobody believes anything anymore. Nobody believes anything. And everybody's trying to grapple for who's right and who's controlling the narrative, who's the authority on truth. And when you hear people say, he's a plant, she's secretly controlled, this movement is staged, you know that it's part of the psyops of the lack matrix. It wants us to feel that way, because it wants us to mistrust everything and have nowhere to anchor our energy into. The only thing that's familiar at that point is we need to have a system that has control and a sense of authority and power so we can feel safe again. So again, this belief appears when awakening has begun, but sovereignty hasn't quite yet anchored within us. So it's our awakening mixed with paranoia instead of power. And it keeps us believing that corruption is this ultimate authority, as I said. So I think it's important to speak to this directly and within yourself. Is there any part of you if some of you may not at all. There's some people who can completely disengage and they haven't engaged at all. I did that for a while and it was bliss. And my psychic energy got re-engaged in 2020, and I have not been able to pull my psychic tentacles out of it completely, because I don't think it's not my calling to yet, because I was meant to understand it. I was meant to understand what was going on and to see things that I never quite saw before. So if any part of you in your awakening, as you expand your capacity to receive, if there's any part of you that's afraid of being co-opted or controlled or influenced by the wrong side or by corruption, or if you are just incredibly suspicious of everybody and everyone who has power, you immediately assume that they're being controlled, or they're being paid, or they're being influenced by the bad side, know that this fear doesn't actually mean you're in danger. It means that you're stepping beyond the system's jurisdiction. And the fear isn't truth. It's an alarm of the old grid losing you. It just wants to pull you back into the drama. Because your sovereignty doesn't make you vulnerable. It makes you unreachable. So the more sovereign you are, the less psychic influence the lack matrix has on you. And the lack matrix will try to psychically pull us back when it feels it's losing its grip on us. So controlled opposition in the lack matrix is not simply, it's not simply political infiltration. It's a consciousness tactic designed to keep humanity trapped inside the binary of lack. So it's this idea that you need to choose your side, and you have to be right and you have to be good, or else something bad will happen, or else you won't receive, because there's not enough for everybody to receive. So you'll be the one that's sacrificed. You'll be the thing that's sacrificed. In the lack matrix, controlled opposition, the idea of it, like energetically speaking, exists to maintain polarity, create the idea of false sides, keeps our attention on conflict rather than creation and creating things and solving problems. It ensures that people fight over power rather than source their power from God. It's just a complete illusion. And it keeps reality framed around the threat of the enemy. It keeps reality framed around threat instead of our potential. And this is not just systems that are controlling rebels. It's lack using rebellion to feed itself. So yes, ultimately every act of rebellion can be used as controlled opposition if we stay in lack and don't become sovereign and don't embody abundance. So it just becomes an ego war of the wounded archetypes in the lack matrix. So in the lack matrix, every rebellion is still plugged into the system it resists. It feeds it. It wants war. It wants war. That's why revolution, when people think of revolution in terms of actual war and start justifying war and justifying death and justifying all of those things, thinking that it's going to liberate us when actually it's literally a sacrifice to the gods of lack. Human life is always the sacrifice. That's why people call it a blood cult, because blood keeps it alive. Humans have to, the magic of what we are keeps it alive. So controlled opposition also exists as a energetic foundation to the lack matrix. It's not just agents of the lack matrix. It's literally the architecture of lack. It's like a psychic firewall. And it ensures that no matter which truth you choose, that you stay in duality. So it doesn't really matter. And it gives us the sense of we chose the right side. So we have that. Our ego gets the sense of I'm right and I'm good. It also allows sort of outrage and righteousness to feel like our purpose. Like it's our purpose to feel outrage, and it's our purpose to be righteous. And I talked a little bit a couple episodes ago, or in the membership, I can't remember where. It might have been in one of the membership videos, exclusive, but I talked about purity contracts and how purity contracts keep us in lack. And it's one of those ways that we can be easily deceived because the ego wants to be good, and we believe we have to be good in order to receive. And this has infiltrated religion and spirituality. So even in the place where we're supposed to receive God directly and freely, not because of anything we've done, but because of what God is, the nature of what God is, and the overflow of what God, even in those places we choose, no, I'm not going to receive God. I have to be worthy. I'm going to prove to God how worthy I am of him, of it, or whatever you want to call it, of her, by how good I am, and by these purity contracts I make with life. And the purity contracts can be the very things that enslave us. In religious circles, this is often called legalism. But it happens in the secular world, and you see it no greater place than politics. Politics loves outrage and righteousness. Who's the more righteous? I thought my phone just rang and I thought it turned off my recording, but it didn't. But who is the most, who's the most worthy by who can prove they're the purest by how much they give to purity and resist the duality of this world, or the polarity of this world, the contrast of this world. So it's this not accepting our incarnation, which, remember, is the first initiation of the Queen of Pentacles. It's full acceptance of our incarnation, which is full acceptance of the body, which is full acceptance of polarity and of light and dark and how they work. Full acceptance means we don't go to war with it. We're not here to go to war with it. That's the lie. So when we are in that, our outrage and our righteousness feels like our purpose, and we get a false sense of rebellion that keeps us from true liberation. We stay in rebellion and we don't get liberated. Liberation comes after freedom. So freedom has this rebellious energy to it. Liberation is where sovereignty exists, and we're not rebelling against anything. We're accepting all things. So the false sense of rebellion actually keeps us from liberation. And it keeps our systems from being liberated from lack. And our attention stays on them, the other, and never on our creative authority. Our attention stays on policing the other rather than creating from our authentic urge. So controlled opposition does not exist to win. It exists to keep the fight alive. That's all that matters. That's why it doesn't matter the side. That's why it can play either side or any side, because it doesn't matter. The fight is the fuel. So how controlled opposition feeds the lack matrix is in 3 ways. Because lack and the lack matrix needs 3 things to survive. It needs tension, contracted energy, because it stops the flow. Remember, it creates a vacuum. I talked about that in one of the last episodes, how unmet needs create a vacuum that actually feeds the lack matrix. So when we have tension and we create restriction in the body, especially chronic tension, we get chronic unmet needs because energy isn't flowing the way that it naturally does. So it feeds off tension, comparison, and external authority. Because comparison matters here, because we have to always know what's right or better or more worthy. And then external authority is important because there's something external that holds the power of whatever we're saying is most worthy. So if you're worthy, then you get to influence, then you get to have power, then you get to tell people what to do, whatever. It's a complete false sense of control. So controlled opposition delivers all three of those: attention, comparison, and external authority, by pushing us into these ideas like, if they win, I lose. I must fight to be safe, or I must sacrifice to be safe. There's an enemy out there that's out to get me, but it's not clear who it is ever. So we're throwing our swords around in the dark. And also this idea that liberation comes through defeating something or someone, not creating. So when we're in this state, we cannot possibly be sovereign, because we are just simply reacting constantly to the lack matrix instead of creating the world that we want, that we urge for. And reactivity keeps us tied psychically to this external grid. That's the psychic warfare. So the spiritual mechanism of this is that when someone starts waking up, the lack matrix basically wants us to rebel, but rebel within the system. It loves the stir up. It doesn't give a fuck what side you choose. It doesn't care. It just loves that you're creating the chaos and the stirring, because power always has to change hands. That's how it stays alive. Eventually, every ruler will be knocked off their pedestal. Eventually, every villain becomes the victim. Every hero becomes every savior becomes the villain. It just always happens that way. We play all roles in that system. It doesn't give a fuck which role you're in. You're not more worthy if you're the villain or the victim or the savior in that paradigm, according to how the lack matrix thrives. So when someone starts waking up, the lack matrix is like, yes, rebel, but rebel within the system. Be loud, be righteous, burn energy, stay angry, but never step outside of polarity. Never step outside of the game. Never see how the game works. Never consider creation over confrontation. Never access the frequency where opposition dissolves. Controlled opposition keeps you fighting a war instead of building and birthing the world that we want, the new world. It keeps us focused on enemies instead of our own embodiment. And it keeps us validating the existence of power outside of us. It's the psychic illusion of revolt that actually strengthens the grid of lack and keeps us very powerfully psychically trauma bonded to the lack matrix. The trap here is the us versus them mentality. Controlled opposition basically uses the oldest spell in the book for this whole matrix, which is there must always be someone in the wrong. And we psychically don't even realize how we're always looking for the enemy. This is where the psychic hypervigilance comes in, hypervigilance. And remember, this is very real. So it's played out in very real ways, and there's been real trauma, and there's a reason for all of this. It's not just like, oh, humans are so stupid, how did they fall for it? No, we've been absolutely fucking traumatized by this enslavement. And it's psychic enslavement first and foremost. So when we believe that there always must be something or someone wrong and an enemy out there that we need to get, it ensures separation consciousness. It ensures shame as control currency. It ensures this idea of moral superiority instead of emotional maturity and connection and co-creation. It ensures external villains instead of internal sovereignty. And when we believe the solution comes through defeating them, those people out there, the bad guys out there, we abandon the one true portal out of the whole thing, which is creation. That's why I say you got to get in your creative energy, and it's sexy. It will. It might not look sexy at all, but ultimately, the pentacle of our sovereignty is when we are in our creative urge and we're letting it overflow, unapologetically. It's the exact opposite of war. The exact opposite. So what does it look like psychologically? Controlled opposition can often feel like moral conviction that's fueled by adrenaline instead of truth. This is where that outrage, and we feed off of it. Social media is so pumped and jacked on this right now. Moral conviction fueled by adrenaline instead of truth and embodiment. It also shows up as hyperfixation on corruption instead of contribution and embodiment. It's outrage that masquerades as awakening. It's this idea of fighting the system instead of outgrowing the system, no longer needing it. It's constant scanning for betrayal, infiltration, purity failures. It's so gross in politics right now. It's worse than religion. The moral manipulation and superiority complexes in politics, to me, is 1,000 times worse than it is in religion. And I've had a gut full of it in religion. It's worse in the secular world. It's beyond, to me, in the secular world, particularly how it plays out in politics. This constant like moral superiority, intellectual superiority that goes on in politics. Is this needing to expose and punish and prove something and be on the right side of history. That is a red fucking flag. That is a red flag. When you hear someone say, you want to be on the right side of history, I'm on the right side of history, you got to do this to be on the right side of history, that is moral manipulation. Do not fall for it. It comes from good intentions for most people. Some people intentionally use it to manipulate the shit out of people. But red flag. Red flag. It's the shadow hero archetype. The crusader that's fueled by lack. Fueled by this idea that there's not enough. Absolutely brimming to the top of their auric field with unmet needs. They're a vacuum in and of themselves, which is why the lack matrix can gobble them up. And the reason why it's so seductive is because when you first wake up to manipulation, the rage can bring clarity. And it's the rage that fuels us to no longer do it anymore, like no longer fall for the bullshit of whatever system we're in. But we make the mistake of thinking it's just our little circle that we're in that's under this. No, it's the whole world. It's the entire globe. It's every system has been infiltrated by this, which is why it's easy to get stuck in this opposed opposition or controlled opposition idea, because it is controlled opposition. They want to keep us in the game of war. They don't give a fuck what side you're on. They, meaning the principalities of the lack matrix. So when you first wake up to this manipulation, this rage, which can bring clarity and often does, especially in the beginning, can help you feel vindicated, powerful, righteous, activated, alive. War energy brings people to life. It brings your whole body to life. Think of if you were actually on a battlefield, how much adrenaline, how much, you probably have never been more alive in your body in the moment, like in that exact moment. But it's sacrifice, remember that. And it's not sovereignty. You're not in sovereignty at that point. It's meant to lead you to sovereignty. But the lack matrix loves to send handlers in here, which we talked about in the last episode. And it loves to keep us in this controlled opposition place where we just keep fighting the enemy. So we were on this side, and now we swing to this side and go, I'm for these guys now. Look how bad these guys are. This is what politics does. We have to see through this. So remember, this is mid-awakening. It's between the cage and the throne. And controlled opposition lives in the hallway here. It lives in this bridge between the two, between captivity and sovereignty. This is where controlled opposition lives. We do not have to live here. So when we allow our abundance consciousness to respond to this belief that there is enough, that we don't have to sacrifice, when we plug into the abundance matrix and root into God, into source, into the womb, we no longer ask who's right and whose team do I need to be on, who do I need to destroy, who's dangerous. Instead, we begin to ask the question, what do I choose to create? What am I creating? What is my resonance feeding and fueling and a part of right now? What am I influencing? Because remember, emotions are contagious. We influence people with emotion in ways that we don't even know. You know this as an empath. So when we begin to ask the question, what do I choose to create, instead of who's right and who's wrong, who must be destroyed, who's the enemy, we get out of this waging war ideology, and instead we begin to withdraw our consent from our energy being used for lack. And then suddenly, guess what? We have energy. We have pentacle energy, and we can invest it in something else. Our magic is being stolen from us. It's being hijacked from us in the lack matrix. So when we move from the lack matrix to the abundance matrix, we move from opposition to origination, to our origin. And what was our creative urge origining? What's the word here? There's something that's being birthed uniquely from your creative urge that's God uniquely expressed in you. There's something that God wants to build through you. So you move out of that opposition energy because you are meant to open and expand your capacity to receive God and all that God has for you. You move in the lack matrix, from this fight energy and the focus being on the fight and the thrill of the fight and the seductiveness of the fight, to the frequency of the solution, to the frequency of the need met. What we're trying to get from the fight that we never actually get. What is the need underneath it that's attempting to be met? That's the frequency we tune into. So we move from this fight and energy to a frequency energy and focus. We move from resistance to resonance. We move from polarity to possibility. From victory, the idea that we have to be victorious, to vision. What is my vision for the future? Without a vision, the people perish. We just snake eating its tail. It's an inverted matrix that will eventually it'll destroy itself. It will go extinct. It's inevitable. We move from this idea of threat to choice. We have a choice here, not just, I feel a threat. What do I have to do? Who do I have to appease? What hoops do I have to jump through so I can feel safe? No. What's your vision? What's your choice? You have creative will. You have choice. We move from survival to sovereignty and from war to creation. So controlled opposition loses power the moment we see that there is no side. There is only source and scarcity. So the sovereign perspective here is that being right doesn't matter. And that a sovereign being doesn't fight the system. It doesn't even give 1 ounce of energy to that system anymore. A sovereign being becomes ungovernable by it. Not through rebellion, but through choice, through creative will. Not through this or that, either or, sacrifice. It's through, what does God want to create through me? What frequency of heaven on earth is being birthed through my resonance, which includes my actual central nervous system, how I'm breathing right now, how I'm focusing right now, what I'm giving my attention to. This is why the body matters so much in this. This is why we're working with the Queen of Pentacles. True liberation comes in the regulation of our central nervous system. And even that is overused. It's really in just being present to our central nervous system, not abandoning ourselves. Being fully in the body, we do not abandon the one's becoming. I do not need an enemy to evolve. I only need to remember who I am. The story of the victim, aggressor, savior paradigm is a part of how we learned what we are. And when we fully integrate it, that's when we overcome it. We no longer need it because we've integrated the lesson of the victim, aggressor, savior paradigm. So remember, we are not at war with what we are. We're not at war with the system we were born into. We're not at war with the victim, aggressor, savior paradigm. We're not at war with the fact that humans tell stories. We're integrating it. We came here to be a part of it. We accept full incarnation of this body. So I do not need an enemy. And I have an enemy. The lack matrix is the enemy to liberation. Do you see how you see the subtlety and the nuance here in this? Because it's not that there's no war or no enemy or nothing to be scared of or no demons. Hell yeah, there is. It's so powerful. It's so strong. We have to be cunning. We have to see through it. That's what this transmission is all about. So you can speak this as out loud if you want, as power. You can write your own, but to reclaim your life and not use war language. Saying something like, I step out of polarity. I leave the battlefield. I choose creation over conflict. I am not controlled by opposition. Do you see how, when you say it that way, you see how it works? When we're locked into polarity, the opposition controls us. The opposition to what we are. I am not controlled by opposition. I am guided by vision. I am guided by creative urge. I am guided by God. I am not at war. I am at work with the Spirit. I am in co-creation with God. My sovereignty liberates me. My sovereignty builds worlds. Begin practicing using language like this. And in the YouTube membership, in the Empath Entrepreneur tier, as we work with the Queen of Pentacles, we are working with statements, power statements that connect us to our sovereignty. These are the subliminals we're working with. So if you want to use some of these subliminals or dive deeper into this or into some of these rituals that we're doing, like the 14-day glow up, to help rewire our central nervous system to work with where controlled opposition is active in our bodies, you can join the YouTube membership. We're going deeper there. And I would love to see you there. So much love. I hope this was helpful, and I will see you in the next one.